Welcome everyone to this second panel of the Global Perspectives on AI Ethics. My name is Stefaan Verhulst and I'm the co-founder of the GovLab at New York University. And I'm delighted to facilitate this panel together with Julia Stoyanovich, who is director at the Center for Responsible AI, also at New York University. Next slide, please. For those who don't know what the Global Perspectives on AI Ethics is, we are a virtual course that was organized together with the Global Consortium on AI Ethics, the Institute for AI Ethics at the Technical University of Munich, and also at the NYU Tandon School of Engineering. And the intent is to really reflect on what are global perspectives, what are global differences, but also what are common trends and patterns as it relates to AI and the ethical implications of AI. What we hope to do is every month to release 4 new videos that will bring different perspectives on 3 different types of areas that touch on AI ethics. Some of those videos will touch on data and how data is impacting AI, and then what are the implications of the use of data that can inform AI and, for instance, deep learning and machine learning. Second type of videos will focus more on the applications of AI and how those applications generate a variety of ethical challenges as questions. And then the third type of videos are looking into the governance approaches, not only diagnosing the challenges, but also how do we actually, from a governance point of view, address some of those challenges. And so that's the intent for the AI ethics course. But in order to not just provide the videos, we thought it would be a great idea to actually also have more of an interactive engagement with the faculty. And that's why we decided to also, in addition to the videos, have every month a panel where those that have shared their video can also reflect on some of the lessons learned and some of the key messages that they wanted to share through the videos. And today, next slide, please. I'm delighted that we will have 3, if feasible, 3 guest faculty join. And over to you, Julia, to perhaps briefly indicate what we can expect today, and then we can get started with really the substance of today.
Thank you, Stefan. It's a pleasure to be here and to welcome so many of you to this second panel of the AI ethics course. And I will go ahead and introduce our 3 panelists, hoping that Ken also joins us. So the first panelist from whom we will hear is Maui Hudson. He is Associate Professor and Director of Te Kotahi Research Institute at the University of Waikato in New Zealand. Maui affiliates with several Maori tribes, and he will say the names of these tribes for us now, please, Maui.
So the primary affiliation is with Te Whakatohia, but also have connections to Ngā Ruahine and Te Mahurehure.
Thank you very much, and apologies for not knowing how to pronounce these. I'll work on that after the session. Maui, as I said, is an associate professor and director of the Te Kotahi Research Institute at the University of Waikato. His research is interdisciplinary in nature, focusing on the application of Maori indigenous knowledge to decision-making across a range of contexts, from new technologies to health, the environment, and innovation. Access to data and governance of data are key issues emerging from his research that led to his involvement in the establishment of Te Mana Raruanga, the Maori Data Sovereignty Network, and the Global Indigenous Data Alliance. Maui is the co-director of Enrich, a collaboration between New York University and University of Waikato, and the co-director of Local Contexts, a system which digitally tags indigenous interests in traditional knowledge and biodata. Our second panelist today will be Jeannie Paterson. She is the co-director of the Center for AI and Digital Ethics, a new collaborative interdisciplinary research, teaching and policy center at the University of Melbourne in Australia, involving the faculties of Computing and Information Systems, Law, Arts, and Science. And she is also co-leader of the Digital Ethics Research stream at the Melbourne Social Equity Institute, an interdisciplinary research institute focused on social equity and community-led research. Jeannie previously lectured at the Faculty of Law at Monash University. She completed her PhD at Monash University as well. And prior to that, she was a solicitor. And we're looking forward to hearing from Jeannie on her perspective as well. And let me also introduce Kan Suzuki, who is a professor at the Graduate School of Public Policy at the University of Tokyo and at the Graduate School of Media and Government at Keio University in Japan. Kan is also the special advisor to the Minister of Education, Culture, Sports, Science and Technology of Japan. After serving at the Ministry of International Trade and Industry at Keio University, Kan Suzuki assumed the post of State Minister of Education, Culture, Sports, Science and Technology during his 12-year career at the House of Councillors. And his recent affiliations include Professor of University of Tokyo and Keio University, and Special Advisor to the ministry that he previously ran. So now let me actually give a very, very quick two-sentence summary of what is coming up in the next few months of the course, AI Ethics Global Perspectives. As Stefaan already mentioned, we have a stellar lineup of speakers for you who will be providing modules that are comprised of pre-recorded lectures on artificial intelligence applications, data and AI, and governance frameworks. And very often more than one of these themes will be covered by a particular module. In addition to lectures, these modules come with supplementary readings. We are releasing new courses during the first week of every month, and we are delighted to have strong interest in the course so far, and are hoping that if you liked the modules, that you will also share information about the course with your friends and colleagues. We see this course as particularly valuable because instructors are sharing with all of us their unique perspectives around AI, on AI ethics around the globe. Stefaan, over to you. You're muted.
There we go. Of course, I have to have every session, I have to have one unmute event. And so I will be very brief. So the run of show for today, at least as we were planning it, is that we will first have Maui, and apologies, and Julia focusing on the issues of indigenous rights and how that translates into an AI context. And then I will be joined, or I will introduce Jeannie, where we will focus on some of the issues of AI, digital marketing, and consumer welfare. And then if all goes well, we will be joined by Ken, but so far we haven't managed to get hold of Ken, and so that might not turn out to be the case. Either way, that will give us more time for Q&A and deliberation. As it relates to Q&A, feel free to raise your questions in the chat, and then we will address that. Some of them we might address during the session, others we will keep for the Q&A at the end when everyone has managed to provide some background about their course. Over to you, Julia.
Thanks. So without further ado, let us start our conversation with Maui Hudson. Maui, welcome. Your insightful module focuses on the idea of indigenous data sovereignty and associated principles, frameworks, and challenges. Could you please tell us more about the origins of this work and the need for indigenous data sovereignty? How has this idea taken root around the world?
Kia ora, Stefaan, and hello to everyone from around the world. It's great to be a part of such an interesting and globally orientated course. Yeah, I'm going to be talking a little bit about, I guess, sort of indigenous data sovereignty and ideas that are, and how that came about as a term. My experience is obviously grounded primarily in indigenous issues as it relates to New Zealand and the Maori population, but it's some of the experiences we've had here shared with our colleagues from other parts of the globe, and primarily those in Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. Although there have been other people involved in the conversations from Central America and Africa as well. But you know, I'm just giving that as the proviso. It has a particular focus from which it's emerged, and I think in lots of ways, it's there are a few sort of different things that were at play. So this was about 5 years ago, and in New Zealand in particular, just starting to get this sort of move towards big data, and the government trying to work out what its role was in terms of making available data sets which it's collected over a long period of time, and allowing that to become a part of, I guess, this new wave of activity and the new possibilities that were emerging because of the way technology had advanced. And so the sorts of conversations that were happening in New Zealand were around what was the social license to use data, and did the government in essence have the right to make data which they had collected from their citizens, and which the citizens had generally thought about, you know, sort of argue, you know, in terms of a social contract, is that we provided health data to the government so that they could use it for health purposes. We provided education data so it could be used for education purposes. We provided tax information so it could be used in that context. And we were moving towards a situation where data sets were now being linked, and data sets were now being shared in a much kind of larger, and also shared by the government with groups outside of the government itself, commercial users, multinational corporations. They were starting to provide services that could make use of big data, and that created a number of concerns, not only for the public at large, but also indigenous communities. Concerns about how others might then make decisions or provide advice based on how they analyzed and interpreted that information. That was then going to have a material effect on the sorts of resources or that indigenous communities might be able to get access to. And so in that way, I think the conversations about control of the data can't be divorced from the conversations about how the data is used, which is where I think you push more into the artificial intelligence aspect of it, even though our conversations really haven't been at that end of the spectrum. And in that way, the idea that data sovereignty as a term, I mean, it's very appealing to indigenous communities on the basis of the sort of power relationships and power struggles they often have with the state. And so I think from an indigenous community point of view, that was part of the attraction. And it was also really leveraging off the kinds of thinking that already existed around data sovereignty in relation to, you know, where the power resides. So, you know, data being subject to the laws of the nation within which it's stored. And so this was feeding into the, you know, how rules around where data sit in the cloud, you know, where data is stored within the cloud, and what that means in terms of, you know, particularly at the time, it was the Patriot Act that had come into play. There was these, discussions about whether the US could be a safe haven for data, particularly in the context of GDPR starting to be, all these conversations about that being initiated in Europe as well. And so there's sort of larger global debates were happening about where data should reside, and indigenous communities got involved. So, our suggestion was that it should be subject to the laws of the nation from which it's collected, including tribal nations.
Okay, so let me ask you this. Your research is focusing on the application of indigenous knowledge to decision-making. Could you give us an example, perhaps based on something that you said in your module or otherwise, of how indigenous knowledge could be applied in a particular domain, for example, healthcare or environment?
Sure. So I think in the I think in the context of the talk, I did talk about Ngā Tikanga Paehere, which was actually a framework that's been put together to inform data access to the integrated data infrastructure. So the New Zealand government's decided to make available access to anonymized data that's been collected across all its different branches. In the first instance, it excluded health data because there were different sort of laws and privacy codes that made it harder for that information to be shared more generally. But you had education data, social welfare data, tax data from a whole variety of agencies, which is then essentially put into this integrated data infrastructure, and researchers can apply to get access to it and use it for research purposes. And so we created, or through projects that I was involved with, that initially started talking about how traditional knowledge was shared. So how did communities share traditional knowledge with other people or share within their community, and the sorts of ideas and concepts that were important in that context. And what we found from identifying these 10 concepts is that some of them related to the decision about whether you would share information, in part related to the data you were talking about, in part related to who you were sharing it with, and then the purpose you were sharing it for. What was the purpose of sharing? So those things ended up helping us frame a series of questions which could then be applied to people asking to access, researchers asking to access data from the integrated data infrastructure. And so working with the people at Statistics New Zealand that were responsible for that infrastructure and those access protocols, they trialed the framework and have now adopted it for everyone that's looking to get data relevant for Maori related projects from the data infrastructure.
Great, thank you. Another question, and that is, what are Maori approaches to artificial intelligence?
So that's an interesting one. There's certainly a couple of areas where people are actively collaborating or working with data sciences, in the context of artificial intelligence. The most obvious example is natural language processing. And so there's a couple of big programs here in New Zealand that are trying to make language, speech to text, text to text translations, speech to text translations, making it more possible for the interactions that people might have with digital systems to be done using, using the Maori language. And so, I guess a bit like the development of speech to text applications. When they originally started, they were always a little bit funny to see what would come up. I mean, I still find I was on a Zoom call a couple of weeks ago, and they had put on the translation function, And it was largely okay until you started saying indigenous words, and the Maori words came up as, you know, entirely different things. So, you know, the systems haven't had a chance to recognize and be trained up. So that becomes a barrier at one level for people to be able to interact, you know, kind of with our digital environment in a way that's consistent with their own worldview. You know, if it's not kind of not the English one, it becomes, you know, a little bit harder. And so that's one area where that's happening. There's certainly people that are exploring the use of augmented reality and virtual reality applications, often for representing their cultural stories, or enhancing their cultural narratives about lands and, you know, and waters in different areas. And so I think those have been really the two they're probably the most visible areas where you see applications, although there are I wouldn't call them mavericks, but, you know, there's individuals in places that have, for whatever reason, you know, their experience has been to develop skills in this area and are advancing things. We have, I don't know if anyone was watching the America's Cup recently, but they had all the kind of, actually, I'm sure all the Italians were watching the America's Cup final. We'll say, thanks for making it a good competition. But glad you didn't beat us. But all the kind of graphic images that we use to show that is actually created by a company that's run by a Maori individual. And then we also have working in the context of a research project with another colleague of mine whose company creates most of the algorithms for that the government uses, sort of decision support algorithms across government as well. So, you know, there's individuals that are doing really neat things, but how it gets expressed within a, I guess what you call a sort of a Maori world, sort of a Maori worldview is sort of limited to language and culture at this point in time.
Thank you very much, Maui. In the interest of time, I will turn it over to Stefaan to continue the conversation, and then we will come back to Q&A. So please keep your questions coming. We will bring them up.
Great. Thanks so much. And moving into another terrain, and I think the whole idea is to juxtapose different issues as relates to data rights and AI rights, and then eventually see whether there are some commonalities as well. Or whether indeed it shows the breadth of perspectives that one needs to take into account when considering AI ethics. But Jeannie, your presentation or video focuses really around the use of big data and machine learning as it relates to digital marketing. And obviously, I think most people, especially here in the US, became aware of big data when we had the famous Target campaign campaign announcement or campaign article, where, as many might remember, there was a clear article that said that because the daughter of because someone had bought a variety of products, that the family received direct marketing with regard to pregnancy, and that the father of the family became very angry because that means, why do you send me all this pregnancy advertising? And it turns out, of course, that the daughter was pregnant, but no one knew. And so that was like a clear, anyway, clear wake-up call that Target had more data and more awareness than the family had about the whereabouts of the individuals. And so it seems to me, Jeannie, that's also what you try to indicate in your video, is that big data really has transformed what companies know about individuals and consumers, but also has transformed how digital marketing is taking place. And so if you could highlight a few of those big trends that we should be aware of, that would be great.
Yeah, thanks, Stefaan, and thanks, Julia, and lovely to meet you, Maui. So I think what I wanted to talk about what I was trying to say in my lecture is that the amount of data that's collected about us is really significant, and data collection practices are ubiquitous. And it's not just Facebook, in fact, as you rightly commented, it's everywhere we go, every supermarket, every bank, walking down the street, information's been collected about us. Now, I talked about advertising and marketing, and often the response when I raise advertising and marketing is, well, who really cares? Because advertising is kind of trivial, and if people want to engage in, you know, the marketplace, what does it matter that firms are using new ways to advertise to them? People are concerned about politics and the effect of big data and deep fakes on politics and our participation in democratic systems, but somehow advertising seems trivial. But I guess I don't think it is. And there's two reasons for that. One is that we as consumers have to engage in the market. It's how we choose to live our lives, define our identity. So the way in which we engage in the market is really important. And the other one is that we're immersed in the market, and in some respects, it shapes our identity. And that might sound like I'm exaggerating, but we spend a lot of time online and in front of TV sets and looking at billboards and the like. And at the moment, we kind of act under the assumption that everybody's seeing the same thing, that what I see when I'm scooting through YouTube or walking down the street, looking at the advertising on buses and billboards, is the same for me as it is for other people. And so while we're constantly being advertised at, we exercise some degree of choice about the advertisements that we look at and follow. But increasingly, advertising is personalized to us. So the information that I see when I look at a screen will be different from my daughter, my son, and my husband. That's perhaps the point of the example from Target. So each of us are seeing different content. Now, if each of us are seeing different content, we don't know what we're not seeing, and we don't know why we're seeing what we are seeing. People don't understand what's happening behind the scenes that determines the advertising that's promoted to them. And if I'm only advertise certain types of products and things, then my worldview is somehow narrowing. My capacity to exercise choice is somehow narrowing. And there's a danger, I think, that each of us just becomes some sort of replica of the data that's been created about us. And to me, that's a problematic situation. It's problematic from a position of competition, but it's also problematic from a sense of really human character and thriving, because it changes, I think, how we see ourselves and the way in which we interact in the world.
And how, I mean, this is interesting, but also how does it, I mean, I think what you rightly emphasized, which is that anyway, it creates those kinds of bubbles to a large extent, but also how does it impact different groups differently? Like there's a famous, one of the elements, for instance, here in the US, that is being used to determine whether someone receives a loan, for instance, right, is based upon whether the person who is using the phone to apply for the loan, if the battery is lower than 10%, then it's an indication, according to the algorithm, that it's very unlikely that the person will be able to pay back the loan. Right? And so you have all those kinds of assumptions that are being made based upon the data that is being used to then target or allow certain kinds of products to be acquired. And so how does it play out anyway for different segments in society as well?
Well, I think that's a really good point, Stefaan. So often we hear from people, oh, it doesn't matter if I give my data away. It doesn't matter if I don't, if I'm not worried about privacy, because I've got nothing to hide. But the point is, I guess, you may have nothing to hide, but there may be reasons why companies want to discriminate against you. Now, discrimination is obviously most offensive and most problematic when discrimination is against groups with protected attributes. So often the effect of the data that's collected and processed and the inferences that can be drawn from, predictive analytics is to actually target and exclude certain groups from participation in the marketplace. Now, again, we may say that's trivial. Okay, well, you don't get an offer for socks or at a bargain price, but that's not at all the case. In many of our societies, I mean, there's got a group of countries represented here, but in, neoliberal democracies, essential services are also provided through the market, right? Credit, insurance, housing, access actually to medical service are all provided through the marketplace. So if we're using predictive analytics to decide who can repay a loan, who can pay their electricity bill, who's a good tenant, then we're opening the possibility to widespread discrimination, but in a way that's not at all transparent, and therefore the response is difficult to provide. So yeah, right, absolutely right. The way products are marketed is important in all sorts of ways that we're only just starting to realise, and it really needs a spotlight on it, other than in terms of, oh, it's a bit trivial and who really cares?
Great. And your point in the lecture is also that that existing data protection regimes don't really address some of those issues, right? And so eager to hear from you, Jeannie, why that is.
Well, it depends a bit where you're living. So if you're in Europe and you have the GDPR, you have extensive data protection, and there's quite a lot of requirements for robust consent that must be given before personal data is collected. In my country, the privacy regime is probably less adept at dealing with the new technologies. And I think in the US, it varies according to what state you're in. California has quite a wide-ranging personal data protection act, but not all states do. But most of those regimes premise the right to collect data on consent. So they say a firm that wants to collect data about individuals must obtain their consent, and consent must be obtained not through sort of a clickbait approach. The uses that will be made of the data must be identified, and you can't do bundled consent. You have to ask for consent for each use of the data. So it's a robust regime. But everything we know about consumer psychology is that they don't pay attention to, when consumers are shopping, they do not pay attention to the fine print. We've had lots of experiments where consumers have clicked OK to terms and conditions that have required them to sell their third child, and do all sorts of other things. So consumers don't read the fine print. So my suspicion, and I think this is proved in some respect, is that people will see those consents and click through them. Now, I don't know about you guys, but whenever I go on a website, it's, do you accept cookies? Do you consent? And I'm like, but I just want to get to the website, and I click through them. So consent is only the beginning. Consent to the collection of data is only the beginning. To my mind, we need to go back to that point that I've made earlier, that people don't really understand the consequences of giving away information about themselves. And you hear it again and again. Facebook has all my data, so why do I care? Or the other one that we hear a lot of is, oh, I'm on social media, but I've used a false name, so it's okay. They won't be able to make inferences about me. But in fact, if you look at the way predictive analytics that's fueled by machine learning techniques works, it's making correlations. It doesn't care about your name. It's looking at the attributes. It's looking at your manifest behavior, not your name and age and address. So the fact people are choosing to use false names or false ages or false addresses doesn't really stop the data collection and predictive analytics that go on. So privacy protection is important, but it isn't not enough. we need to think about what other things are important to us. And there's some suggestions, say in Europe, that we shouldn't do targeted advertising to children. Children are still forming their identities, and we shouldn't be using techniques that effectively are not soft nudges, they're hard nudges. They're, you know, maneuvering people into particular purchasing positions and particular identity positions. So maybe we should think about whether we want to impose bans on some of these practices. And if we don't want to impose bans, then we need to think about giving real bite to the rhetoric of AI ethics and making sure that those principles of AI ethics, like do no harm and respect autonomy and be transparent, are really given full force rather than are just words we throw around.
That's great, and it reminds me in the past, as you probably know, Jeannie, I was the co-founder of a center at Oxford University that looked into comparative communications law and policy, and anyway, that was in the 90s, and even then we were arguing whether, for instance, advertising on TV, right? So like at that time in Germany, you still had advertising separate from broadcasting, right? So you had like all the advertising was like in 30 minutes, saying like, now we stop with the usual channel, and we will have 30 minutes of advertising to really make distinction between what was content and what was advertising. But anyway, when we moved into the internet, the whole idea was that this is impossible because it's all on demand as opposed to being pushed. So how would that work in an on-demand where people actually click and there is no real programming happening? Is that feasible from your point of view, where you actually have advertising kind of distinction?
Is it feasible to control advertising when it's all on demand?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I think it is, because at the end of the day, the responsibilities with the products that are being promoted, and there's a lot of talk these days about, oh, who's responsible for the harms caused by technology? Well, at the end of the day, the people who should be responsible for the harms caused by technologies are those who benefit from it. So yes, we can't always monitor what people are choosing to watch, but we can talk to the people who are choosing to do the advertising about where and how they're advertising. So AI is just a tool. It's still multinational corporations that choose to make use of it. And to some extent, discussions about AI and the capacities of AI and the degree to which it can replicate human intelligence, or the sophistication with which it can understand language or emotion, are distractions from the fact that the person who's benefiting from this is still the corporation that's marketing products or politics. Because let's not forget that in this sphere, we're consuming information about goods and services, traditional consumer products, in the same way that we're consuming information about politics. And so our political views and our participation in democratic processes is being manipulated and managed in the same ways that our preferences or our desires to purchase consumer goods is being manipulated and managed. So to say, oh, well, it's a bit tricky, and I know, Stefaan, you're not saying this because consumers are engaging with media in different ways, is kind of, you know, dodging the real question, which is who's benefiting.
I could capitalize this for the rest of the panel. So over to you, Julia. And it seems, Maui, you had like some reaction to the question as well. So feel free to chime in. So you're on.
You're muted.
Yeah, I had to do that as well. Are you talking about the Q&A or this? I mean, I'm sort of, you know, really interested in what Jeannie's saying as well, and because I think, you know, those Indigenous communities are feeling the same way essentially about the data that's being collected, and you know, there's a question in the Q&A about talking about, you know, when making data subject to the laws of the nation from which it's collected, do any risks arise regarding political havens and other types of loopholes? And I think, we're already seeing the effect of actually the European Union putting in place a GDPR on external infrastructures. So things that aren't within Europe, but they're operating down here, but where they have to be done in a way that's then compliant with the GDPR, given that they're going to have people from over there that are I guess inputting data in from those places. So you already had a sort of a shaping and a change there. And I think in lots of ways, it's really how do you enforce a level of responsibility across all of these players within this kind of broader system when it can't be done at a state level, or it hasn't, or the state has sort of absolved their responsibility for that sort of activity and behavior because it's happening in a kind of a global or multinational environment. And I think the sort of there has been a push away from, or an active push that the internet is just this open space that should be unregulated, but we can kind of see in that environment who takes advantage of it and sort of what the outcome is. And so I sort of definitely support the things that Jeannie's saying of how is the value and benefits that are being created being appropriately shared, but also when there's risks that are being generated, who takes responsibilities for it? Because in lots of cases, it seems that everyone's looking the other way.
Yeah, these are very insightful comments that connect to much of what people are also asking in Q&A, and that is, if I may generalize slightly, a lot of AI ethics is indeed context specific, but our reasoning about it comes down to what are the benefits and to whom are these the benefits, and what are the risks or the harms and to whom are these the harms. So a couple of questions to you, Maui, about this. Do you know of evidence of bias or discrimination or other adverse impacts for indigenous people from the use of AI in or out of NLP? And also kind of to tag on to that a little bit, is there insights that we can get from indigenous knowledge about how to reason about the harms and the benefits, how to surface them?
Yeah, so I think the conversation about Māori engagement with AI and thinking about NLP and those is really what are the positive spaces? Well, what are the places where communities have actively engaged by choice because they're trying to realize something which they want to see happen? Most of the places where I would sort of argue that Indigenous communities are engaging with AI are in areas where it's not by choice. It's become part of some algorithmic decision-making process that's actually related to some kind of administrative process, and usually an administrative process with the Crown, although, Jeannie's also been talking about in the context of, kind of consumer activities and behaviors as well. But, there's lots of examples where ethnicity or race is one of the factors that's used to inform the outcomes of algorithms. And often this is in the, kind of instances of parole. It's been, I think, a lot of the stuff at NYU and even with the AI Now Institute, been looking at different ways that different groups and classes of people have been discriminated against. And often, you can discriminate against an Indigenous community as the community in the place where they're from, but they can also be discriminated against as the individual living in other places. And there's lots of Indigenous people living in urban environments that are then just going to be subject to what people have decided, or someone's decided is in a logical way of dealing with it, dealing with sort of, I guess, past. What am I trying to say here? They think it makes sense to use ethnicity as a variable in making these decisions based on past data sets, but the bias present in those past data sets is just being reflected into this new environment. So all it's doing is embedding a bias rather than something else. And that's where I think that's where a lot of communities have expressed concerns.
Great, thank you for that comment. Let me ask both of you, perhaps Jeannie first. Ethics is contextual, says Dia. There is no consistent norm across regions, cultures, jurisdictions, etc. How do we then derive the necessary standards and policies to ensure that AI isn't limiting people's rights to think, respond, and engage? And I might add to that editorially, should we derive a single consistent set of standards? Jeannie, to you.
It's a tricky one because, of course, values and social norms are very contextual. And somebody living in a colonized country, I'm very aware of not imposing, my particular values and norms on the people on whose country I live, or generally. But at the same time, I think it's important that arguments about the wobbly or the uncertain boundaries of AI ethics shouldn't blind us to the fact that it's really important that we think about an ethical framework, even if it's a broad one, even if it's a one that allows flexibility. And, different social groups may have different views about the way to which they want to embed privacy in their community or how they even understand privacy. But at the end of the day, AI ethical frameworks say things like, do no harm, don't actually develop technology that harms people. Now, we can have discussions about what's harm and what types of behaviours constitute harm. But at the end of the day, AI technology shouldn't harm people. It should aim to enrich people's lives, not limit people's lives. And I think we can't get away from that. We'll stop.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, look, I agree. I mean, just in the same way as we have to, work out what language we can use to, engage in a conversation with people from other areas, you end up with some degree of consistency or something which you can all agree to. I think that the problem usually arises actually in the sort of interpretation stage, and particularly when another group tells you that it's not harmful to you when you're clearly saying it's harmful to you. And that's not about, whether there's the principle in place. It's really about who's applying the principle. And then that tends to be more of a sort of a power discussion rather than an ethical one. Well,
yeah, I think that's right. And that comes back to some of Stefaan's work. I mean, AI localism, which is Stefaan's doing, that's Stefaan's project, is about, I think, exploring those sorts of questions. So it's not a one size fits all. There's an opportunity for people to have a say and contribute in the discussions about the type of technologies they want in their lives and how those might be designed and deployed. And Stefaan, would you agree with that?
Well, first of all, it's our project, Jeannie. Maybe you're part of it. So yes, I would agree with that.
And Julia's work as well, I should say.
Yeah, so I'm not part of the AI localism project, although I think of it very highly, but my colleague Mona Sloan is.
Yeah, Mona is great.
Right. Okay.
But I mean, these sort of conversations, I think that the problem with new emerging technologies is they're often portrayed as omnipotent, as something that's being rolled out, and there's very little opportunities for individuals to comment or control the discussion, where I think the more we have education and conversation that's almost de-romanticizing the power of AI, the more likely we are to develop complex networks of understanding and ethics that guide the way we use these technologies.
So let me continue on this positive thread. Sorry, Maui. Yes, go ahead.
Oh, no, I'm going to link this to the next question as well. So, you know, there's one here talking about collective approaches to thinking about data. And I think this is, you know, this idea that you have a collective approach to how data would be dealt with essentially starts to do that. And I think this is one of the, essentially the issues, you know, because we've allowed our response to some of the challenges in this data space to be dealt with by the consent and by the click box and by the individual, rather than thinking about, well, actually, this is a collective issue we're trying to deal with. If we're thinking about this sort of data or the spaces, you know, the commons, and then what are the rules around the commons, and, you know, how people would think about or buy into that. And I think the commons, you know, I've been saying a lot of times that, you know, the commons was something that's present in every culture. It's just that, you know, I think in the West there's an extra few hundred years of kind of discussion and debate around property, which is sort of buried it. And with a lot of indigenous communities, that's you know, we're sort of heading down the same track, but it's a closer part. It's a more kind of connection to those sorts of ideas, which we can then kind of bring back into the debate and the discussion about what does what might a collective approach look like, or what are the sorts of principles that we're still using as well to deal with collective resources that might be applied to kind of different areas of data.
That's interesting, Maui. And I want to briefly, if it's okay, Julia, now that we are totally distorting the flow anyhow, one of my favorite projects, again, in the past when I was in a different function, was building an approach to folklore. I mean, the European Commission asked me to develop should folklore fall under the WIPO regime, right? So the World Intellectual Property Organization regimes. And again, that was linked with this notion of ownership and collective ownership of, in this case, practices and traditions. And how does that relate to your work in the data space?
Yeah, so we are in the middle of so with the project that I'm involved with, and this is alongside colleagues at NYU as well, around labeling data sets and trying to have ways of those communities being able to reflect what their relationship with that data is in terms of like kind of provenance, what sorts of traditional protocols are associated with that data, and then what kind of permissions they see enabling others to be able to use it if it's sitting in, you know, these open environments, and just starting to make a little bit more transparent and visible that there are other ways that people or other ways people think is the right way for sharing or accessing that information, even if you can, because it's, you know, already out there in an open environment. At least it invites people to be respectful and responsible in the ways they access and use it.
Great. Julia, over to you. I'm sensitive to time. We have like
I'm dying to ask this one question that I really liked from Q&A, and that is
that's the last question, and then we will have to close, unfortunately.
And Maui, it's on you to end on a positive note. I'm hoping that this question will allow us to do that, and that is, what are the types of government or non-government initiatives about democratizing AI within the Maori youth communities? Is AI perceived as an opportunity for higher inclusivity? And there was another question that said, is there actually an opportunity to use AI to help preserve the Maori culture? Or is it seen as a widening the digital divide and technological colonization?
So what's that thing they said, you know, that any kind of tool has got a double edge. So it's a little bit like a sword, and it depends on, you know, and how you want to use it, and then who is wielding it as well. So in terms of it being something which is useful for Indigenous communities, it's in part going to depend on whether or not you can build the capacity in those communities to use it for the things that they would use it for. And if that's something positive, like, I don't know, clearing some area so that makes more space for them, then that's a good thing. But if it's something that's used against them, and I think that tends to be the experience, because while it might have some positive outcomes for our communities, they're not the ones using it. The tools of AI are being deployed by those groups that have the resources and the capacity, and they're multinational. They're not ones that have necessarily our interests at heart, unless we can find good people sitting in them that want to work in a better way.
Good. So insisting on my positive slant still, what would it take to turn this around?
And this could also be Jeannie might have a view on it.
Yeah.
Please, either one of you.
Jeannie, you have a view.
I do have a view. I think it comes back to this. I think it comes back to education. I would say that I'm an academic, but I do think it comes back to education. But education starting at a primary level, because a lot of the discussions I see from kids about AI in school kind of associate AI with magical. We can do anything we want with this new technology. I think that's actually profoundly disempowering. I think it's really important that kids from the ground up understand how technologies work, that they're a tool that can be used for good, but also can be used to discriminate and harm people, so that they're confident to ask questions and challenge the outputs of technology. If we think it's magic, we probably don't challenge it, but we understand how algorithmic processes work, the way in which they generalize data, the way they make predictions merely on the basis of the past, then I think we're giving ourselves and young people the tools actually to take charge and perhaps think about how data and technologies can be used for good, to reflect their life experiences, their values, rather than them being somehow reduced to some large corporation's image of who they might or should be.
I'm going to take Jeannie as a closing statement from you, and I couldn't agree with it more. So Maui, your closing thoughts.
So my closing statement is going to be the flip side of that, and that's the how to get towards a positive space. I think in the meantime, we do actually need to do something about thinking about regulation. So if you think about like expectations around products, and that if someone manufactures something and that product is faulty, then they're liable for it. You think about cars doing recalls, you think about products being created that then have something wrong with it. We don't seem to have the same thing happening in the kind of the digital services space, or AI. You can create things and they can create all sorts of harm, and there's no one that ends up being responsible for it in the same sort of way. And I think until you create some responsibility around these creations, we're going to just see people doing more and more kind of bad things, because they end up being lucrative. It's what the sorts of incentives we create and what sort of environment we want to encourage this to us to live in.
Great. Well, with that, we unfortunately gonna have to close, and this was fabulous. And as you can see, we could go on for another few hours, but if you want to find out more, visit the AI ethics course. And also, if you have not watched the lectures by Maui and Jeannie, where they really go into depth about what you should know, feel free to check out the videos. And with that, thanks everyone for joining. Julia, do you wanna have a final word?
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. Take care. Stay safe.
Bye-bye.